The rain that night was cold enough to seep through her skin, past the thin fabric of the coat she had worn far too many winters, until it settled deep in her bones. It wasn't the kind of cold you could shake off. It was the kind that reminded you didn't belong anywhere warm. Amelia kept walking, her boots slapping against the slick pavement. The hood of her coat pulled forward so far she could barely see. She knew the streets here better than most people knew the layout of their own kitchens. But still she moved cautiously, staying in the shadows, keeping her ears tuned for trouble. The city could be cruel at night, especially to someone like her, a woman with no home, no family, and nothing but a battered wooden box to her name. That box was tucked under her arm now, as it always was, to anyone else. It looked like junk scratched, water-stained, the brass hinges slightly bent. But to Amelia, it was worth more than every glittering chandelier in the mansions she sometimes cleaned. Inside lay the last thing her father had ever given her, the last piece of a life that had been stolen 20 years ago. She pressed it closer as the wind whipped down the alley, bringing with it the faint hum of music from somewhere far off, a reminder that, just beyond the rain and cold, people were laughing, eating, living lives she could barely remember. She hadn't always been invisible. Once, she'd been the daughter of Edward Collins, a man whose name should have been written in history books beside words like visionary and pioneer. Her father had spent nearly 2 decades working on a revolutionary clean energy system, one he believed could change the world. She had grown up in the glow of his passion, the quiet hum of his workshop filling their modest home, the scent of solder and oil clinging to his clothes when he hugged her goodnight. He had called her my light and told her stories about a future where no child would cough from factory smoke, where the sky would stay blue forever. But dreams, she had learned, were fragile things. All it took to shatter hers was one man, Harold Grant. He had been her father's friend once, or so Edward believed, handsome, charming, with the kind of polished manners that made people want to trust him. He'd come to their home with expensive wine and easy smiles, talking about investors, patents, and the future. He promised to help Edward navigate the legal maze, to protect his work from the vultures, and Edward, brilliant in the workshop, but to trusting outside it, handed over the original blueprints. It had taken less than a month for Harold to disappear along with every right to the invention. The contract Edward had signed, never imagining betrayal, was airtight. Harold's name appeared in the patent registry soon after, tied to a newly formed corporation, Grant Industries. Edward's name was gone, erased. The betrayal hollowed him. He stopped going to the workshop. Bills went unpaid. The laughter in their home turned to silence. Amelia watched her father shrink in spirit until one day, his body followed an abrupt stroke, and he was gone. She was 18, alone, and the debts that came calling after his death were as merciless as Harold's lawyers. She lost the house, the workshop, everything but the wooden box her father had pressed into her hands the night before he died. Inside was a small piece of metal, no bigger than her palm, with a serial number etched so precisely it caught the light even in the dimmest room. Her father had told her, his voice ragged but fierce, "This is the heart of it. Amelia, keep it safe. One day, it will give you back what's yours." She had carried it with her every day since, never letting it out of her sight. Years of scraping by had taught her where to sleep without being noticed, which shops would hand over leftovers without questions, how to make herself invisible. But she never forgot Harold. She read about him sometimes in discarded newspapers, or on the TV screens in store windows. Harold Grant, billionaire philanthropist, lauded for his clean energy breakthroughs. Each headline was a twist of the knife. And then, 3 nights ago, she had seen him. She had been walking past the gates of an estate in the wealthy part of town, her hood pulled low against the drizzle, when a black limousine had glided to a stop. The rear door opened, and Harold stepped out. Older now, but still with that aura of untouchable power. In the moment before the guard hustled her along, she noticed something every Friday night. He hosted a private dinner. The guests were chauffeured, in laughter spilling out as they entered, and when the night was over, bags of untouched food were thrown away without a thought. That was when the idea took hold. It was absurd, maybe even dangerous, but she couldn't shake it. She would approach him not to beg for money or a job, but to offer a trade. She would ask for the leftovers in exchange for something, small enough to hold in one hand, something he would recognize instantly, the piece of metal in her wooden box. Not to give it to him permanently, but to make him see it, to remind him that the thing he thought was buried forever was still out there, still beyond his control. Now, standing across from the mansion gates in the icy rain, she waited. Her coat was soaked through, the cold gnawing at her fingers, but she stayed where she was. One by one, the dinner guests began to leave, their laughter fading as they were whisked away in gleaming cars. Finally, the limousine rolled up to the gate, and Harold stepped out to speak to his driver. His eyes swept the street and landed on her. For a second, she thought he might dismiss her without a word. Instead, he lifted a hand, and the guard who had started toward her stopped. Harold approached, his shoes barely splashing in the puddles, his expression unreadable. "You look lost," he said, his voice as smooth as it had been 20 years ago. "Or maybe you're exactly where you want to be. Which is it?" She met his gaze, her voice steady despite the cold. "I want to make a trade." One of his eyebrows lifted. "A trade?" "Yes. Your leftovers for this." She opened the box just enough for the light from the gate lamps to glint off the etched metal inside. The change in his face was almost imperceptible, but she saw it, the flicker of recognition, the tightening at the corner of his mouth. It lasted only a heartbeat before his mask returned. "Give her the food," he told the guard without taking his eyes off her. The man returned a moment later with a heavy paper bag, the smell of roast meat and fresh bread curling into the cold air. She took it without thanks, tucking the box back under her coat. "Enjoy your meal," Harold said, and turned away. She started down the street, her boots crunching against grit and broken leaves. Halfway down the block, she glanced back at the mansion. On the second-floor balcony, half hidden in shadow, a man stood watching her. He was tall, his posture still, his eyes fixed on her, like a predator marking its prey. and something in her gut told her he knew exactly what she was carrying. The rain chased her down the street, each gust of wind driving the cold deeper. But Amelia's thoughts were louder than the storm. She could still see the man on the balcony, his unmoving silhouette, the way he had stood there as though the night itself was his to command. That was not the posture of a curious party guest. It was the stance of someone who already knew exactly who she was and what she carried. The bag of food swung lightly at her side, heavy enough to feed her for days, but she barely felt it. The real weight was the wooden box pressed under her arm, and the memory of Harold's brief, involuntary reaction when he saw what lay inside it. That single flicker in his eyes was enough to confirm everything her father had told her. Harold knew, and now someone else in that mansion knew too. She turned off the main street into a narrower lane where the glow from the mansion's lights couldn't follow. Her boots splashed in shallow puddles as she moved faster, glancing back every few steps. The street behind her seemed empty, but the hair on her neck prickled. She'd lived too many years on the edge to ignore that instinct had saved her life more than once. At the corner, she ducked into an alley she knew well. It twisted between old brick warehouses, their windows boarded, graffiti peeling from the damp walls. She moved quickly, knowing she could disappear here if she had to. The smell of wet metal and oil was strong, a reminder that this part of the city had been forgotten by everyone but people like her. Halfway down, she stopped, her breath clouding the cold air. A shape detached itself from the darkness at the far end, tall, broad-shouldered, moving with the deliberate calm of someone who didn't need to rush. The same man from the balcony. His hat brim shed a steady stream of rain, shadowing his eyes, but she felt his gaze like a physical touch. Amelia's grip tightened on the box. She backed toward the mouth of the alley, but he mirrored her steps, closing the distance with unnerving precision. Her heartbeat kicked into a faster rhythm. This wasn't some random drunk or street thief. This was a man who knew how to hunt. Without a word, she turned and sprinted toward the next crossway. Her boots slipped on slick cobblestones, the bag of food swinging wildly against her hip. She cut down a side passage, then another, navigating the city's forgotten veins with the instinct of someone who'd had to learn every shortcut to survive. But the sound of his footsteps was never far behind, measured, steady, unhurried. As though he knew she couldn't escape him, she vaulted over a rusted gate into the back lot of an old auto shop, weaving between dead cars with shattered windshields. She paused in the shadow of a stacked pile of tires, straining to hear. The rain drummed against metal roofs, masking softer sounds, but there too steps, then silence. He was still following. She moved again, slipping into the narrow gap between two buildings. The space was so tight she had to turn sideways to pass, the wet brick scraping against her coat. When she emerged on the other side, the street was empty. The silence pressed in around her, broken only by the hiss of tires on distant roads. Amelia forced herself to keep moving, though every nerve in her body screamed to stop and listen. She headed for one of her safe spots, a building she'd used before when the streets got too dangerous. It was an old textile warehouse, long abandoned, with a single unlocked door hidden in the shadows of a loading dock. She slipped inside, closing it quietly behind her. The air inside was thick with the scent of mildew and rust. Water dripped somewhere in the dark, the slow, rhythmic plink echoing off the high walls. She found her corner by memory, a sheltered space between two collapsed shelving units. Lowering herself to the dusty floor, she set the bag of food aside and pulled the box into her lap. For a moment, she let herself look at it, running her fingers over the worn wood. She opened it just enough to see the gleam of the metal piece inside. Even in the faint light filtering through broken windows, the serial numbers were sharp. Her father's voice rose in her memory. One day, it will give you back what's yours. She didn't know how. But tonight had confirmed one thing: Harold wanted it. And that meant it was more powerful than she dared to believe. A faint creak made her freeze. It had come from the far side of the room. She snapped the box shut, tucking it under her coat as she rose. Her eyes scanned the darkness. But before she could call out, a voice came from the shadows low, cautious. "Don't be afraid. I'm not here to hurt you." A young man stepped into the thin shaft of moonlight, his clothes too clean for these streets, his hair plastered to his forehead from the rain. His gaze went straight to where the box was hidden under her coat. "You've been followed," he said, "and if you don't move now, they'll catch you." Amelia's stance didn't soften. "Who are you?" "Someone who used to work for him," the young man said, his tone sharp with urgency. "Until I found out what he really is." Her grip tightened. "And what is that? A thief? A liar?" And worse, he took a step closer, lowering his voice. "That piece of metal you have, it's not just part of a machine. It's the core. The system can't run without it. He's been faking it for years. But if the truth comes out..." He broke off, his head snapping toward the door. Heavy footsteps were approaching, slow and deliberate. Amelia's pulse spiked. The young man's eyes widened. "It's him. The one from the balcony. We have to go. Now." She grabbed the bag of food, cradling the box under her coat, and followed him toward the back of the warehouse. A narrow exit led into another alley, but the moment they stepped out, a tall figure blocked their path. The brim of his hat dripped with rain, his face hidden in shadow. He didn't speak at first. He didn't need to. The way he stood, the way his presence filled the narrow space, it all said the same thing. They weren't leaving without giving him what he wanted. Rainwater dripped steadily from the brim of his hat, tracing silver lines down the dark fabric of his coat before vanishing into the black shadow that clung to him. The narrow alley seemed to shrink with his presence, the damp brick walls pressing in closer, the smell of wet asphalt rising between them. Amelia felt the weight of the wooden box under her coat like it had suddenly doubled. The young man beside her shifted, putting himself half a step in front of her, as though that would be enough to shield her from the force standing in their way. "You've had a long night," the man said finally, his voice low but clear, cutting through the patter of rain. "Let's end it before it gets worse. Hand it over." His words were calm, but they left no room for misunderstanding. He wasn't asking, He was warning. Amelia's fingers clenched tighter round the box. Her pulse hammered in her ears, the rest of the world narrowing to the dark figure in front of her. She took a small step back, her shoulder brushing against the young man's arm. "She doesn't have what you're looking for," the young man said quickly, his tone sharper now, like he thought speed might make the lie believable. The man's head tilted slightly, rainwater spilling in a small arc from the brim of his hat. "I don't follow people through a storm for a sack of bread." His gaze, hidden in shadow, locked on Amelia. "You've been carrying something that doesn't belong to you for a very long time. Tonight, it comes home." Something inside her snapped at his words. "It never belonged to you," she said, her voice low but steady. "It was stolen from my father." The man didn't flinch. "That's not my concern." The young man took a step forward, planting himself directly in the stranger's path. "Then make it your concern to walk away." The man in the hat didn't bother to answer. Instead, he shifted his weight slightly to one side, and the faintest sound reached Amelia's ears, the murmur of a car engine somewhere nearby, the purr of something expensive and powerful. The younger man stiffened, glancing over his shoulder toward the street behind them. The sound was moving closer, the light drizzle carrying with it the low growl of tires on wet pavement. The man in the hat's posture didn't change, but Amelia could feel the invisible clock ticking. He didn't need to rush. The trap was already set. From somewhere deeper in the alley, headlights bloomed, glaring in the rain, throwing long shadows across the slick walls. A black SUV rolled forward slowly, deliberately, sealing off the only exit behind them. The driver's window stayed up, but the tinted glass reflected the pale light from above, making it impossible to see inside. The engine idled like a predator, breathing, patient and inevitable. The young man swore under his breath, his weight shifting subtly as he calculated. "When I move," he murmured to Amelia without looking at her, "you run." Before she could answer, he lunged at the man in the hat, slamming him sideways into the brick wall. The sound of the impact echoed in the narrow space, mixing with the rush of rain. Amelia didn't wait. Her legs were moving before she could think, boots splashing through shallow puddles as she tore down the alley toward the narrowing gap. Beside the SUV, a sharp voice barked behind her, but the words were swallowed by the storm. She darted past the SUV's front bumper, the driver jerking forward as if to block her. But she was already gone, skidding onto a side street slick with water. The box banged against her ribs with each stride, the paper bag of food threatening to tear in her grip. Her lungs burned, her breath ragged, but she didn't slow. She took a hard left into another alley, this one narrower, the walls closing in on either side. The sound of footsteps pounded behind her, not the steady, patient stride from before, but faster now, angrier. She didn't dare look back. A chain-link fence loomed ahead, the metal glistening with rain. She hit it at a run, hauling herself up, her hands slipping on the wet links, boots scrabbling for purchase. She swung one leg over just as a shadow lunged at the base of the fence. She dropped to the other side, landing hard on her knees before pushing back up. The street she landed on was unfamiliar, but she could hear the city's heartbeat, hear traffic somewhere beyond. Voices muffled by the rain. She darted toward it, keeping to the deepest shadows, her mind racing. Whoever that man was, he wasn't working alone. And if Harold was involved, this was only the beginning. She turned a corner and froze, parked at the curb just ahead. Another black SUV idled, its headlights cutting through the rain like blades. The rear door was open, and in the dim interior light she saw him, Harold Grant. He sat back in the leather seat, his silver hair catching the glow, his expression smooth as glass. "Amelia," he called, his voice carrying over the sound of the storm. "Get in. We need to talk." Her stomach tightened. Behind her, footsteps splashed closer. Ahead of her, Harold's open door waited like the mouth of a trap. She was caught. Between them, the air heavy with the inevitability of whichever choice she made. The sound of his voice hit her harder than the cold rain. It was the same voice she'd heard at her father's table 2 decades ago, smooth and polished, wrapping lies in silk. Harold Grant sat in the back of the SUV as if the storm outside didn't exist, as if the world bent itself to keep him dry. His gaze was steady, calculating, and the faintest curve of a smile played at his mouth an expression that in another life might have seemed charming, but here felt like the opening move of a trap. Behind her, the footsteps were closer, the rhythm steady and inevitable. She didn't have the luxury of thinking long. The alley mouth behind her would soon be filled with the shadow of the man in the hat. Ahead, Harold's open door was an invitation she didn't trust, but at least it was an opening. Rain poured off the roof of the SUV, pattering against the curb like a ticking clock. "Get in, Amelia," Harold said again, this time softer, almost coaxing. "Before he reaches you." Her grip on the wooden box tightened until her knuckles ached. "Why?" she asked, her voice sharp over the hiss of rain. "So you can take what's mine," he chuckled, the sound low and rich. "You think too small. I'm offering you a chance to stop running." "You mean hand it over?" she shot back. He didn't deny it. "Everything has a price. You've been carrying that piece of metal around for 20 years. And for what? Cold nights and empty pockets. I can give you more than your father ever dreamed, more than you can imagine." She took a step closer to the SUV, not because she believed him, but because the footsteps behind her had turned into a shadow, stretching long across the wet pavement. Harold's eyes flicked past her shoulder and then back, his smile sharpening. "You can choose to get in and talk like adults," he said, "or you can let him decide what happens next." The man in the hat appeared at the edge of the headlights, water dripping from the brim. He didn't rush, didn't speak, just closed the distance one measured step at a time. Harold leaned back slightly, his voice dropping to a murmur only. She could hear. "He works for me, most of the time. But I wouldn't bet your life on his loyalty." The man in the hat stopped a few feet from her. "She's coming with me," he said, his tone flat. Harold's jaw tightened. "I don't recall giving you that order." "I'm not here for your orders," the man replied. The air between them thickened, the storm seeming to still for a heartbeat. Amelia felt like a rope in a tug of war. both ends pulled taut. Her chest was tight, her mind racing for any opening. Then, in a flash of instinct, she dropped low, pivoted away from both men, and bolted across the street. Shouts erupted behind her. Tires screeched as the SUV jerked forward, blocking part of her path. But she swerved hard and ducked into a side street. The bag of food slammed against her hip, the box a solid weight against her ribs. She didn't look back. The wet pavement blurred under her as she ran, the sound of pursuit splintering in the rain boots behind her, an engine revving somewhere to the left. She cut through a narrow gap between two buildings, emerging into a courtyard littered with dumpsters and broken pallets. The stench of rot and oil hit her nose, but she kept moving, vaulting over debris. Ahead, a rusted gate loomed. She hit it at speed, climbed, and dropped down on the other side into yet another street. But she wasn't alone. A figure stepped out from a recessed doorway just ahead, the young man from the warehouse. His eyes widened when he saw her. "Come on," he hissed, grabbing her arm. She didn't have time to question how he'd found her. He pulled her into the doorway and slammed the heavy metal door shut. Behind them, they were in a dim, narrow hallway that smelled faintly of gasoline. "They're all over the block," he said, breathless. "We have to move now." They threaded through a labyrinth of back passages until they emerged in another alley on the far side of the block. For a moment, the rain and the darkness seemed to hide them. Then the low growl of engines reached her ears. Two black SUVs slid into view from opposite ends of the alley, headlights flaring. Hemming them in, doors opened in unison, and shadows stepped out, men in dark coats moving with the precision of a closing net. The young man's hand tightened on her arm. "Stay behind me." Amelia's eyes darted from one end of the alley to the other. There was no gap, no escape, only the wet gleam of the pavement under the harsh beams of light. Her pulse thudded in her ears. The wooden box under her coat seemed to hum with danger, as if it knew what was at stake. The man in the hat emerged from the group at one end, Harold from the other. They advanced slowly, deliberately, the rain slicking their hair and coats. Harold's eyes locked on hers, and even through the storm she could read the certainty in them. He believed this was already over. The rain turned the alley into a mirror, headlights cutting jagged shapes into the slick black surface. Amelia's chest was tight, her breath shallow and quick, the air cold enough to sting with every inhale. Harold's polished shoes clicked against the pavement with deliberate rhythm, each step measured, each movement calculated to remind her that he never rushed, because in his mind, he always won. On the other side, the man in the hat moved without sound, his shadow stretching across the wet ground until it brushed against her feet. Between them, the young man shifted his weight, scanning for any weakness, any gap in the net closing around them. "You're out of options," Harold said over the hum of the idling engines. His voice was calm, but the storm carried it down. "The alley like a blade through water. You can walk out of here with me, or you can be dragged out by someone far less patient." Amelia's grip on the wooden box tightened until her fingers ached. "And give you the one thing that proves everything you've built is a lie?" His smile flickered. "Just for a heartbeat. before settling back into place. Truth is overrated. Power is what survives. The man in the hat took a step forward, his boots landing without a splash. Enough talking. She comes with me. His voice was quiet, but it sliced through the rain, making Harold's eyes narrow. You work for me, Harold said, the smooth edge gone from his tone now, replaced by something colder. The man didn't even blink. I work for whoever gets the job done. The younger man leaned close to Amelia, his voice barely audible. On my signal, we run left side. There's a fire escape halfway down if we make it. Before she could nod, the man in the hat moved, faster than she expected, and the young man shoved her hard toward the wall. Go, he shouted. She stumbled but caught herself, bolting toward the left side of the alley. Shouts erupted, the sound of boots splashing after her. But the rain blurred the world into streaks of grey and silver. The fire escape was there, a rusted lattice clinging to the brick, its lowest rung just out of reach. She jumped, fingers catching the cold metal, pulling herself up with a grunt. Her shoulders screamed in protest, but she didn't stop. Below, the young man was a blur of motion, throwing himself between her and the nearest pursuer. Harold's voice barked an order she couldn't make out, drowned by the clash of footsteps and the clang of the ladder as she climbed. The rain made everything slick, each rung an icy challenge, but adrenaline drove her higher. Halfway up, she glanced down. The man in the hat wasn't following the ladder, he was scaling the wall itself, his gloved hands gripping the uneven brick as if the rain didn't exist. He moved like he'd done this 100 times, his eyes never leaving hers. She climbed faster, lungs burning, until she reached the landing. The metal groaned under her weight, the bolts creaking ominously. She darted along the platform toward the next ladder up, but a shadow rose from below, a hand gripping the railing ahead of her. It was him. Nowhere left to go, he said quietly. She spun toward the opposite side, eyes locking on the rusted door that opened onto the building's interior. It was locked, the padlock heavy and corroded. She hit it with her shoulder, pain flaring through her arm, but it held. Behind her, the man in the hat stepped closer, the space between them shrinking. Then, from the street below, Harold's voice rose again, calm and certain. Careful with her. She's worth more alive. The man in the hat's eyes narrowed slightly, and in that flicker of hesitation, Amelia acted. She kicked hard at the railing beside her, the rusted metal giving way with a screech. The gap opened to the empty air over the alley, rain streaming into the void. Without thinking, she swung herself over and dropped. The fall wasn't far, but it was enough to knock the air from her lungs when she hit the dumpster below. Pain shot through her back as she rolled off onto the wet pavement. She staggered to her feet, clutching the box under her coat, and ran behind her. Shouts erupted again. The young man appeared from a side path, blood on his lip, but determination in his eyes. This way, he yelled, grabbing her arm and pulling her toward a narrow cut between two buildings. They ran blind through the rain, the world a blur of shadows and light. Sirens wailed somewhere far off, but closer came the sound of another engine roaring to life. They burst into a wider street, only to see yet another black SUV swing into view from the far end, its headlights blinding. The young man swore, "We're not going to make it." The SUV's tires screamed as it skidded to a halt beside them. The passenger door flew open, and a voice shouted over the rain, urgent and unfamiliar, "Get in if you want to live." The door yawned open like a sudden escape hatch in the middle of a burning building. Amelia didn't stop to think. She dove into the SUV, the young man right behind her, slamming the door before the rain could follow them inside. The driver, a woman with sharp eyes and rain-slick hair plastered to her forehead, threw the gear shift forward. The SUV lurched into motion, tires cutting through puddles with a roar. Behind them, shouts grew faint as the alleyway fell away, swallowed by the sheets of rain. Amelia clutched the wooden box to her chest, every muscle in her body still taut with the need to run. She glanced at the driver. "Who are you?" The woman's gaze flicked briefly to the rearview mirror. "Someone who doesn't have time for introductions. You're in trouble. And I don't mean the kind you can talk your way out of." The young man leaned forward from the back seat, scanning the streets behind them. "You followed us." "Watched you," the woman corrected. "There's a difference." Amelia's pulse was still pounding in her ears. "If you've been watching, you know Harold's after me. And you know why." The woman's jaw tightened. "I know enough to get you out. The rest can wait." The SUV cut sharply down a side street, the wipers struggling against the torrent. Amelia pressed her forehead to the cold glass, watching the blurred shapes of street lamps streak past. For a moment, she thought they might have lost them. Then headlights flared in the side mirror. "Two cars," the young man said, voice low, closing fast. The woman's hands tightened on the wheel. "They won't risk hitting us, not with you inside. But they will try to box us in." She accelerated, the engine's growl filling the cabin. The streets here were narrower, lined with shuttered shops and darkened windows. The tires splashed through standing water, the SUV swaying as they took a corner to fast. A block ahead, another set of headlights appeared, cutting across their path. The woman swore under her breath, yanking the wheel into an alley so tight. Amelia was certain they'd scrape the sides. The echo of the engine bounced off the brick walls, and for a moment the sound of the rain was replaced by the pounding in her chest. They burst out onto a wider road, only for a black SUV to appear. Directly ahead, its grille like a steel wall bearing down on them. The woman didn't hesitate. She jerked the wheel again, sending them onto a ramp leading up to an elevated section of the city. The road here was slicker, the guardrails rusted and low. The young man braced himself. "If they push us here, they won't." The woman cut him off. "Not yet." But the lead SUV swerved into their lane, forcing them toward the edge. The guardrail groaned as their tires kissed it, sparks snapping in the rain. Amelia's grip on the box tightened until her knuckles burned. "Hold on," the woman said. She slammed the brakes and cranked the wheel hard. The SUV skidded sideways, the pursuing vehicle overshooting by a few feet. The woman floored it, slipping past on the inside before the other driver could recover. For a heartbeat, The road ahead was clear. Then a shape dropped from above. It landed in the middle of the lane with a heavy thud, rain cascading off a long coat. Even through the windshield, Amelia recognized the man in the hat. He stood perfectly still, water streaming down his face, eyes locked on hers. "Go through him," the young man shouted. The woman's foot pressed harder to the pedal, but in the last second, the man stepped aside only to slam something metallic against the side of the SUV as they passed. The sound was like a gunshot, and the vehicle jolted violently. "Tires gone," the woman shouted. The SUV fishtailed, momentum dragging it toward the guardrail. The young man grabbed Amelia, shielding her as the vehicle slammed into the rail. With a shuddering impact, metal screamed. The wooden box nearly slipped from her arms out. The woman barked. They stumbled into the rain, the three of them half running, half falling along the elevated road. Below, city lights blurred in the downpour. Somewhere behind them, a door slammed, and heavy footsteps followed. Amelia glanced back to see the man in the hat walking toward them. Unhurried, he didn't need to run. He knew there was nowhere left to go. The young man pulled her toward a service ladder bolted to the side of the road. "We can get down from here." The ladder was slick, the rungs icy under her hands. She climbed, the wind pulling at her coat. The box pressed tight against her ribs. The woman went last, glancing up every few seconds. "Move faster," she urged. Halfway down, a shot rang out. The metal beside Amelia's hand sparked, and she froze. Another shot, closer this time. The man in the hat was above, gun in hand, still moving with that same deliberate pace. The young man dropped the last few feet to the ground, reaching up to catch her when she followed. The woman landed a second later, grabbing them both and pulling them into the cover of a nearby maintenance shed. Inside, the air smelled of oil and rust. Water dripped steadily from the ceiling. Amelia's breath came in ragged bursts, the cold cutting deep now that they weren't running. The woman pulled a phone from her pocket, dialing quickly. "I've got her," she said into the receiver. "But we've got company." A pause. Then, understood. She hung up and turned to Amelia. "You have no idea how many people want what's in that box." Amelia hugged it closer. "And you're one of them." The woman didn't answer. Instead, she listened to the rain, her gaze fixed on the shed door. "We need to move before he finds another way down." But even as she spoke, a shadow darkened the small gap under the door. A single drop of rain slid across the threshold, tracing a slow, deliberate line like the first mark of an inevitable signature. The handle began to turn. The metallic click of the door handle felt louder than the rain. In that cramped shed, every sound seemed amplified, bouncing off the rusted walls and hammering into Amelia's spine. She gripped the box so tightly her fingertips ached, her nails biting into the old wood. The young man's eyes darted to the woman, searching her face for instruction. But she raised a finger to her lips. Silence, stillness. The only movement was the subtle shift of her weight. A fighter anticipating the first strike. The handle twisted halfway before stopping. The shadow at the base of the door didn't move. For a heartbeat, Amelia thought maybe they'd been wrong, Maybe it was just the wind or a trick of the rain. But then, without warning, the door burst inward. The man in the hat filled the frame, water streaming off him, his eyes locked with the predator's patience on the box in Amelia's arms. The woman moved first. She kicked the door back toward him, catching his wrist and forcing the gun up. The shot went into the roof, sending a cascade of rust flakes down like dying embers. The young man lunged forward, tackling the intruders. Midsection, but the man in the hat was stronger than he looked. He absorbed the impact, shoving the young man aside as if brushing away an inconvenience. His eyes never left the box. Amelia's breath came fast, her body screaming at her to run, but her feet felt nailed to the concrete. The woman shouted over her shoulder, "Go!" But the word barely registered before the man in the hat grabbed the doorframe and swung inside. His coat whipped around him like a curtain, droplets of water spinning off into the dim light. He didn't aim the gun this time. Instead, he stepped toward Amelia, slow and deliberate, like a man who knew the prey had nowhere left to go. She backed up until her shoulder blades hit the cold wall. The box pressed painfully against her chest. "I don't know what you think is in here," she managed, her voice shaking. "But it's not worth killing for." His expression didn't change. "Everything is worth killing for if you know what it buys." The woman launched herself at him from the side, catching his arm and wrenching it backward. The gun clattered to the floor, spinning once before stopping at the young man's feet. He dove for it, but the man in the hat twisted free, slamming the woman into the wall hard enough to make the shed tremble. Amelia flinched at the sound, her knuckles whitening on the box. The young man brought the gun up, his hands trembling. "Stop," he barked, for the first time. The man in the hat looked away from Amelia, his gaze settling on the weapon. His mouth curved into something between a smirk and a snarl. "You won't pull that trigger." The young man's grip faltered, just for a moment, but it was enough. The man in the hat lunged, knocking the gun away and sending it skittering into the dark corner of the shed. The woman was on him again instantly, a blur of motion and desperation, but he caught her by the throat, lifting her just enough that her boots scraped against the floor. Her hands clawed at his wrist, her face darkening. Amelia's chest felt like it was being crushed from the inside. She didn't think she just moved. She swung the box like a weapon, catching him across the side of the head. The impact made a dull, sickening thud, and he staggered, dropping the woman. She collapsed to her knees, coughing, as the young man grabbed Amelia's arm. "Run!" They bolted for the back of the shed, shoving open a narrow service door. Cold rain slapped Amelia's face as they stumbled into the night. Behind them, the man in the hat roared a deep, guttural sound that cut through the storm like a blade. She didn't dare look back. The alley they entered was barely lit, puddles reflecting fractured pieces of the city. They ran blind, feet splashing, breaths ragged. The woman caught up to them, her voice hoarse. This way. She led them through a maze of narrow streets until Amelia's sense of direction unraveled completely. At last, they ducked into a recessed doorway, the heavy scent of wet concrete pressing down on them. The woman leaned against the wall, one hand pressed to her ribs, He's not going to stop. Not until he has it. Amelia looked down at the box, rainwater dripping from its corners. Then tell me what's in it. I have the right to know. The woman's gaze was sharp even in the dim light. If I tell you, you won't want to carry it anymore, and we need you to carry it. We? Amelia asked, suspicion coiling in her stomach. Before the woman could answer, a low rumble vibrated through the street, a car engine idling somewhere too close. The young man peered around the edge of the doorway. It's them. At least two vehicles. The woman pushed off the wall, straightening despite the pain etched on her face. We can't stay here. There's a place, a safe house, but it's not close. Amelia's arms were aching from holding the box, but she tightened her grip anyway. Then we move. They slipped back into the rain, keeping to the deepest shadows. Every few steps, Amelia caught the glint of headlights somewhere behind them, like a hunter's eyes catching light in the dark. Her legs burned, her lungs protested, but fear kept her moving. Eventually, the streets began to change. Fewer lights, more boarded windows, the hum of the city fading into the relentless hiss of rain. The woman led them to a row of warehouses, their outlines jagged against the storm. She rapped a specific pattern on a metal door, and after a long moment, it creaked open just enough for a narrow face to peer out. "They're right behind us," she said quickly. The man at the door hesitated, then swung it wider, letting them inside. The warehouse was cavernous and dim, the smell of dust and oil mixing with the damp air clinging to their clothes. Rows of wooden crates stretched into the shadows. Somewhere, high above, water dripped steadily into a metal bucket, the sound echoing like a clock ticking down. "This way," the doorman said, leading them toward a staircase at the back. His voice was low, urgent. "We don't have long." But as they reached the bottom of the stairs, a crash split the air, the front door slamming open so hard it bounced against the wall. Heavy boots pounded on the concrete floor. Amelia didn't need to turn to know who it was. That measured, deliberate pace could only belong to the man in the hat. The woman shoved the young man forward. "Take her. Go." Amelia resisted. "I'm not leaving you." "Yes, you are," she snapped, pushing her toward the stairs. "Get to the roof. Now." The young man grabbed her arm and pulled, and before she could fight it, they were climbing, the sound of pursuit growing louder below. The warehouse seemed to stretch endlessly upward, the stairs twisting around huge steel support beams. Amelia's breath came in sharp bursts, every muscle screaming. Halfway up, a gunshot cracked, the sound ricocheting through the metal. A bullet sparked against the railing inches from her hand. She ducked instinctively, heart hammering. The young man didn't slow. "Almost there," he said between breaths. They burst through a door onto the roof. The rain colder here, driven sideways by the wind. The city sprawled out below in a haze of wet lights. The young man pulled her toward the far edge, where a metal fire escape clung precariously to the side of the building. Then a voice rose from behind them, calm and certain. "You can't run forever, Amelia." She turned. The man in the hat stood in the doorway, rain streaking his face, the brim dripping steadily. In his right hand, the gun. In his left, Dangling like a dead weight was the woman. Her head lolled forward, eyes closed. "Put the box down," he said, his voice cutting through the storm, "or she dies." The rain seemed to freeze in the air for a heartbeat, every droplet suspended between the rooftop and the black sky. Amelia's chest tightened, her fingers locking harder round the box. Though her mind screamed at her to let it go, the woman's head sagged against the man in the hat's grip, her soaked hair plastered to her face, blood from a cut on her temple mixing with the water. The man's voice was steady, the tone of someone who believed he had already won. "You don't have the luxury of time. Put it down." His gaze didn't flicker to the young man, didn't even acknowledge the fire escape a few steps away. It was as though he could see straight into Amelia's thoughts, weighing every possible choice she might make. The young man shifted slightly, his body angled just enough to shield Amelia without making it obvious. "You heard her," he said, his voice low but firm, "and you'll never get it." The man in the hat's smirk was small, almost pitying. "You think she's my only leverage. You have no idea who else is already watching." The words were meant to destabilize, to seed doubt. Amelia felt them crawl into her chest like cold fingers. Somewhere deep down, she knew this wasn't just about a box, it was about the network behind it. The invisible threads she couldn't yet see. She forced her voice to be steady, though her throat was raw. "If you kill her, you lose the only person who knows how to open it." The man in the hat's eyes narrowed just enough to betray interest. "So you do know?" It was a dangerous slip, but she couldn't afford to back down now. The young man caught on instantly. "That's right. And if you want what's inside, you're going to have to play by our rules." The man in the hat laughed not loud, but with the weary amusement of someone who'd heard empty threats before. "Your rules? Look around you. You're on a roof, in the rain, cornered, with nowhere to go. My rules are the only ones that matter." The young man's hand inched toward his pocket, slow enough to be invisible unless you were watching for it. Amelia could feel the current of his movement. Without even looking, she needed to buy him time. "Then why haven't you just shot us?" she asked, her voice cutting through the wind. His answer was immediate. "Because dead couriers are bad for business. But I can make exceptions." The young man's fingers closed around something in his pocket, small, metallic. Amelia remembered the faint clink she'd heard earlier, when he'd stumbled in the alley. A blade, a key. She didn't know, but she held the man in the hat's gaze, refusing to look away. "You think this is business," she said, taking a slow step forward, "but you're wrong. This is personal, and if it's personal for you, it's personal for me too." His jaw tightened ever so slightly, a tell she wouldn't have noticed if she weren't watching him like prey. That was when the young man moved not toward him, but toward the box. In one motion, he wrenched it from Amelia's grip and hurled it over the side of the roof. The man in the hat's eyes widened in disbelief, his head snapping toward the ledge. The moment his focus broke, the young man lunged forward, slamming into him with a force that knocked them both sideways. The woman slipped from the man's grasp, crumpling to the wet concrete. Amelia dropped to her knees beside her, feeling for a pulse. It was there, weak but steady. The sounds of the struggle blurred into the roar of the rain and the pounding of her own heartbeat. The young man and the man in the hat were locked in a vicious grapple, neither gaining the upper hand. The gun clattered to the ground. Spinning dangerously close to the edge, Amelia saw the glint of metal under the rooftop light, and, without thinking, she dove for it. Her fingers closed around the cold grip just as the man in the hat broke free from the young man and lunged at her. She raised the weapon, her hands trembling so badly she thought she might drop it. His eyes locked onto hers, and for the first time, she saw something other than control in them, something like calculation giving way to doubt. "You won't do it," he said, echoing the same challenge he'd thrown at the young man in the shed. Only this time, Amelia didn't hesitate. The shot rang out, a deafening crack swallowed by the storm. The man in the hat staggered backward, clutching his shoulder, his face twisted, not in pain, but in fury. "This isn't over," he spat, before retreating toward the roof access door. In seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the dark stairwell. The young man was at Amelia's side instantly, helping her steady the gun. "Are you okay?" She nodded, though her entire body felt like it was vibrating. "The box," she said suddenly, looking toward the edge. He followed her gaze. "I didn't throw it all the way down." Confusion flickered across her face. "What do you mean?" He reached under his jacket and pulled out the box, completely dry. "I tossed an empty crate I found near the fire escape." He took the bait. Relief crashed into her so hard she almost laughed. But it came out as a shaky exhale instead. "You planned that," he shrugged. "Not exactly. But sometimes you have to improvise." The woman groaned, her eyes fluttering open. Amelia squeezed her hand. "You're safe." The woman's gaze drifted to the young man holding the box. "Not for long," she rasped. "He's not alone. He never is." As if on cue, a low rumble rose from the streets below. More engines. Closer this time. The young man's expression hardened. "We can't stay here." Amelia helped the woman to her feet, every muscle in her body screaming from the adrenaline crash. They made their way to the fire escape. The box clutched tightly once more in Amelia's arms. The descent was treacherous, the metal slick with rain, every step a calculated risk. By the time they reached the ground, the sound of engines had grown into a swarm, echoing off the narrow streets. The woman pointed toward an alley barely wide enough for two people to walk side by side. "Through there. There's a market on the other side crowded enough to disappear in." They moved quickly, shadows stretching under the flickering streetlights. Amelia's heart hammered in rhythm with her footsteps, the box a constant weight against her ribs. When they emerged into the market, the air was thick with the scent of wet produce and fried food. The chatter of voices competing with the patter of rain on tarps overhead. The young man guided them through the crush of people, weaving between stalls with practiced ease. Every time Amelia glanced back, she expected to see the brim of that hat cutting through the crowd. But all she saw were strangers, wet, hurried, uninterested, still. The sense of being hunted clung to her skin. They stopped at a stall selling cheap electronics, the vendor barely looking up as the young man slipped something into his hand. Without a word, the vendor jerked his head toward the back of the stall. A curtain lifted to reveal a narrow passageway, lit only by the glow of a single bare bulb. "Go," the young man said. "I'll cover the entrance." Amelia hesitated. "What about you?" His eyes met hers, steady and unreadable. "I'll find you. Just keep moving." She wanted to argue, to demand they stick together, but there was no time. She ducked through the curtain with the woman, the passageway smelling faintly of oil and damp concrete. At the end was a door that opened into another alley, this one quieter, shielded from the market's chaos. The woman leaned heavily on Amelia, her breath shallow. "He'll come for you," she whispered, "not the box you." The words lodged in Amelia's chest like a shard of ice. "Why me?" The woman's eyes were dark, unreadable. "Because you're the only one who can decide what happens next." They kept moving, the alley twisting until Amelia lost all sense of direction. The rain began to ease, the storm's fury giving way to a steady drizzle. Somewhere behind them, a faint sound cut through the damp air, a slow, deliberate clap. They froze. From the shadows ahead, a figure stepped forward. Not the man in the hat, someone else, taller, broader, his face hidden beneath a hood. "You've done well," the stranger said, his voice deep and smooth. "Better than we expected." Amelia tightened her grip on the box, her pulse spiking. "Who are you?" The stranger smiled, though it didn't reach his eyes. "Someone who's been waiting for you to deliver our property." Her stomach sank. "You're with him." The stranger tilted his head. "I'm above him." He took a slow step forward. "Now, hand it over." Amelia's fingers curled tighter round the box until her knuckles turned white. The smooth surface slick from rain and sweat. The man in the hood stopped just short of the light spilling. From the alley mouth, his shadow stretching toward her, like a threat. Behind him, the drizzle turned into a fine mist, catching the glow of a distant street lamp and turning the night into a haze. She felt the woman beside her tense, a faint tremor in the grip that clung to her sleeve. "You don't want to do this," Amelia said, her voice steadier than she expected. The man's smile deepened. "On the contrary, I've been waiting years for this moment." Her mind worked furiously, recalling every half-truth the young man had told her, every cryptic warning from the woman. If this man was above the one in the hat, then the danger they'd just survived had only been a prelude. "What's in here that's worth all of this?" she asked, shifting her weight subtly, ready to move if he lunged. He tilted his head as though considering whether to answer, then said, "A truth that changes everything. A truth that belongs to us." His gaze dropped briefly to the woman leaning on Amelia, and to her, once, until she betrayed us. The woman's breath caught. "I didn't betray you. I saved it." The man chuckled, low and humorless. "You saved yourself. Don't rewrite history." His eyes returned to Amelia. "Hand it over, and you walk away alive. Refuse, and you'll watch her die before your heart even realizes what's happening." The words were calm, almost gentle, but Amelia felt the razor edge beneath them. Somewhere deep inside, the seed of fear began to sprout. but she forced herself to remember the rooftop. The moment she'd pulled the trigger without flinching. This was the same choice, only bigger. "I don't walk away," she said finally. "Not until I know what's inside." For the first time, the man's composure cracked. It was tiny, a flicker of annoyance, a tightening of the jaw. But she saw it. Curiosity, he murmured, is a dangerous disease. He took a step closer. "And it's fatal in your case." The woman beside her gripped her arm harder. "Run," she whispered, so softly Amelia almost thought she imagined it. But where? The alley behind them was a dead end. Ahead was the hooded man. And somewhere out there, the man in the hat would be recovering, rallying his forces. A movement. To her left caught her eye, the faintest ripple of shadow against the wall. Before she could react, the young man emerged from the darkness, silent as a thought. In one motion, he was behind the hooded man, an arm snaking around his throat. The man staggered, but didn't panic. "You think this will work?" he rasped. The young man's voice was low and urgent. "It only needs to work long enough." He jerked his chin at Amelia. "Go," she hesitated, torn between running and staying. The woman shoved her. "Move." Amelia bolted past them. The box clutched tight, her feet pounding on wet concrete. The alley opened into a deserted street. The storefronts shuttered, neon signs flickering half-heartedly against the rain. She didn't know where she was going, only that she had to keep moving. Behind her, a sound of struggle spilled into the street. Grunts, the scrape of shoes, something heavy hitting the wall. Then a sharp, pained exhale, and silence. Her heart seized. She slowed, turned, and saw the young man stumbling toward her, one hand pressed to his side. "He's not down," he said, breathless. "We have maybe 30 seconds." The woman limped after him, her eyes darting to every shadow. "There's an old station 2 blocks east. We can hide there." Amelia didn't ask how she knew. She just ran, the 3 of them moving in a ragged formation. The rain had picked up again, harder now, masking their footsteps, but also blurring her vision. Twice she nearly slipped, but the box never left her grasp. At the station, they ducked. Inside, through a rusted side door, the air smelled of metal and damp earth. The tiled floor slick under their shoes. Long abandoned benches lined the walls. They were warped with age. They collapsed onto the nearest bench, breathing hard. The young man's wound was bleeding, but not as badly as she'd feared. "We can't keep running," Amelia said between gasps. "They'll find us." The woman looked at her with an expression that was equal parts fear and resolve. "Then open it." The young man's head snapped toward her. "Now, here," she nodded. "If we know what's inside, we can decide where it should go. If we don't, we're just playing their game." Amelia hesitated, her hands trembling slightly as she set the box on the bench. "What if it's worse than we think?" The woman's eyes didn't waver. "Then at least we'll know." The lock was intricate, a design Amelia had never seen before. But as her fingers traced the ridges, something in her memory stirred. The way the young man had once shown her to turn a coin just so. The rhythm of a code hidden in plain sight. She pressed a sequence of points, and with a soft click, the lid sprang open. Inside, nestled in black velvet, was a slim metal drive no bigger than her thumb. For a moment, disappointment washed over her. All this, for this. The woman reached in, her fingers brushing the drive as if it might burn her. It's not what it looks like. That's not just data. It's the ledger. The young man's eyes widened. You mean the woman cut him off? Names, dates, every transaction, every order, every kill. If this gets out, the whole network burns. Amelia stared at the drive, a new weight settling on her shoulders. So whoever controls this, controls everything. The woman nodded grimly. That's why they'll never stop, and why we can't let it fall back into their hands. The sound of a door creaking echoed through the station, faint but unmistakable. The young man was on his feet instantly, scanning the shadows. They're here. Amelia snapped the box shut, tucking the drive into her jacket. We split up. The young man said, "Make them chase 3 trails instead of 1. The woman shook her head. No, if they catch either of us, they'll still get it. She's the only one who can disappear. Amelia's throat tightened. What makes you think I can? The woman's eyes softened for the first time. Because you already have. Your whole life, you've been slipping past people who underestimated you. Do it one more time. The young man handed her a folded piece of paper. An address. If you make it there, someone will help you finish this. The footsteps were closer now, heavy and deliberate. Amelia looked from one to the other, her heart splitting at the thought of leaving them. You'll make it, she asked. The young man smiled faintly. We'll make noise. The woman squeezed her arm. Go. Amelia forced herself to turn, to run down the far corridor. She didn't look back, because if she did, she might not be able to leave. The station stretched ahead in darkness, the only light coming from cracks in the boarded windows. Her breath echoed in her ears, louder than the footsteps behind her. At the far end, a service door hung ajar, leading into a tunnel she didn't recognize. She slipped inside, pulling it shut behind her. The air was thick with the smell of oil and rust. She followed the tunnel's curve until the station was gone from sight, then stopped to catch her breath. For a moment, she allowed herself to believe she'd lost them. Then a voice floated from the darkness ahead, smooth, familiar, and chilling. You've been busy. Amelia. She froze. From the shadows, the man in the hat stepped forward, his shoulder bound in makeshift bandages, his eyes gleaming with a mixture of pain and triumph. And now, he said, we finish what we started. Amelia's pulse roared in her ears, her mind flicking through every narrow escape she had survived in the past few days. Every false safe place, every time she thought she was done running. Now the man in the hat stood only a few steps away, his posture loose but predatory, the faint hiss of the rain beyond the tunnel mixing with the slow, deliberate scrape of his boots against the concrete. The makeshift bandages at his shoulder were soaked, but he moved as though pain was a luxury he could choose to ignore. His gaze dropped briefly to her jacket, where the outline of the drive pressed faintly against the fabric. You've carried that far enough, he said softly, as though coaxing a child to give up a toy. She shifted her weight backward, fingers curling into fists. "If you wanted it so badly," she said, "you should have kept a better grip on it the first time." His smile didn't reach his eyes. "I underestimated you. I won't again." He took a slow step forward, and she instinctively took one back. The tunnel wall met her shoulder, cold and unyielding. "Where are your friends?" she asked. Buying seconds, his expression flickered, tied up, bleeding. Wishing they'd chosen different allies, she felt a spike of heat rise in her chest. But she forced her voice to stay level. "You're lying." He tilted his head. "Do you want to test that?" Her mind raced. The paper with the address was still in her pocket, dry despite the rain. She needed to get to it, to get there, but he blocked the only clear path. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked, keeping him talking. "You don't look like someone who follows orders." A faint crack in his composure appeared, and she pressed on. "You're not doing this for the network. You're doing it for yourself." His eyes narrowed. "I'm doing it because power should be in the hands of those who know how to use it. That ledger isn't a weapon in the right hands. It's salvation. And in the wrong hands," she countered. His grin was thin as wire. "It's still salvation, just for fewer people." He lunged without warning. She twisted sideways, the motion more instinct than plan, feeling his fingers brush the fabric of her sleeve. She shoved hard, sending him into the tunnel wall, and sprinted down the curve into the dark. Behind her, his footsteps exploded into the still air, closing fast. The tunnel dipped slightly, slick with condensation, the ceiling low enough that she ducked as she ran. A metal grate loomed ahead, blocking the way, but the bolts at one corner were rusted through. She dropped to her knees, shoved at it with both hands. It gave just enough for her to slip through, scraping her arm raw in the process. On the other side, the tunnel opened into a service chamber littered with old equipment and the scent of mold. She darted behind a stack of crates, heart pounding, listening to his footsteps stop at the grate. "You can't hide forever," his voice echoed, calm and certain. "The only way this ends is with me walking out of here with that drive." She stayed still, forcing her breath quiet. After a pause, the sound of metal shifting told her he was trying the grate. She moved quickly to the far side of the chamber, spotting a narrow stairwell leading upward. Each step groaned under her weight, but she didn't slow until she emerged. Into a small, forgotten storage room, a single door led outside, but it was padlocked from the inside, as if someone had once tried to keep the world out. She scanned the room. Broken shelves, dust-thick tarps, a length of rusted pipe. She grabbed the pipe, wedged it through the lock's hasp, and heaved. Metal groaned, then snapped. She threw the door open and found herself in a narrow back alley, the rain pounding harder now, washing the grime from the brick walls in dark streaks. She took 2 steps into the open before the shadow fell across her path. He had found another way around. The man in the hat stood at the alley's mouth, rain dripping from the brim, his free hand holding a small revolver leveled at her chest. "Enough," he said simply. She froze, the cold barrel's implied weight settling between her ribs. "Drop it." Her fingers brushed the drive through her jacket. She thought of the woman's voice in the station. She's the only one who can disappear. She thought of the young man's blood on the concrete of the rooftop, of every choice that had brought her here, and she realized there was no path where she walked away untouched. Slowly, she unzipped her jacket, pulled the drive out, and held it up between them. His eyes locked on it, hungry, certain. In that instant, she moved, not toward him, but toward the storm drain running along the alley's edge. She dropped the drive into the rushing water. His face twisted, and he fired. The shot tore through the air, deafening at close range. But she had already thrown herself sideways behind a dumpster. The water swallowed the drive, carrying it into darkness. He stalked forward, revolver tracking her. "You just signed your death," he snarled. She straightened from behind the dumpster, rain plastering her hair to her face, and met his gaze. "No," she said, voice steady despite the ringing in her ears. "I just signed yours." A sound rose behind him, the scuff of shoes, the low command of a voice she knew. The young man burst into the alley, one arm bleeding, the other holding a length of rebar. He didn't hesitate. The swing caught the man in the hat across the back, sending him sprawling into the water. The gun clattered away. The current was stronger than it looked. In seconds, the man in the hat was dragged toward the drain, his hands clawed for purchase. But the slick brick and pounding rain betrayed him. He locked eyes with Amelia one last time, a flash of fury and something like respect crossing his face, before the water claimed him. Silence fell, broken only by the rain. The young man sagged against the dumpster, breathing hard. "Tell me you didn't just. It's gone," she said, cutting him off. "No one gets it now." His jaw tightened, but he nodded. "Then we have to move. They'll still come." They walked away from the alley together, the rain washing the blood and grime from their faces. The paper with the address was still in her pocket, but she didn't know if she would ever use it. Some truths weren't meant to be saved, only buried deep enough that no one could dig them up. Somewhere behind them, the city swallowed the alley, the station, the tunnels, and the drive. Ahead, the streets stretched out, slick and shining, waiting for whatever came next. And for the first time in days, Amelia allowed herself a single, fragile thought that maybe, just maybe, she had finally stopped running.